So welcome to the Ignium Sparks podcast. Today I'm with Dr. David Ricketts. He's an innovation fellow at Harvard University. Today we're going to be talking about a number of subjects, including simply what is information, but more importantly, how do you create a culture of innovation in a business? We've often looked at how to build a business from ground up to scale it. And we always talk about culture being the number one level before you build on it. So really, you've got to look at how to innovate and you've got to build that culture. So David, thank you for joining us today on the Sparks podcast. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I use that title there, Innovation Fellow. What does that mean?
So at Harvard and at many universities that are sort of based on the classical, older, actually English universities, the fellow is just a person who does research on a particular area. And my focus has been on innovation. And it's interesting because I think everybody thinks of themselves as being innovative and wanting to be more innovative and thinks innovation's key. But to do research and innovation sounds a little bit maybe counterintuitive because it's something we do, it's not something we research. And so a lot of my time has been spent trying to understand who's successful at it, why are they successful, and I think more importantly, how could you or I or other people be taught or learn to be more effective and innovative?
Yeah, I think that's, and I think this thing about how can you be teaching people to be or learn to be more innovative, because when I talk about businesses and we talk about growing this culture, the key bit is around how do you get the team to work? And you've got some people in business who they love the status quo, and you've got another team who want to be changing, want to be entrepreneurial. So the question I always ask is, what does innovation actually mean for people? Because we have a view on it, but what is it?
So it's interesting. So first off, I was doing a little bit of research, and the word innovation really didn't start coming into proper use as it is today until like the 1980s. And so it's a rather modern kind of concept. And I think it comes out of the progression for us as a society that I think is coupled in part with the high-speed acceleration of technology and of digitization. Certainly the web has done this. Jim Stikelether, who was the CTO of Dell, described it to me as, we're becoming a frictionless society. So probably from the 70s with the advent of the personal computer until now, suddenly things are becoming much easier for us to do. And I think that acceleration makes us think more about transformation, and the idea of innovation becomes important. I think, I'm going to answer you in two ways. One is, I think really, why do we use the word innovation?
Yep.
And for me, the situation is usually like this. I'm in a company and I'm successful to some extent, but I know I need to be someplace far ahead of where I am. I either need to be in a brand new market, I need to be scaling much more faster, I need to be doing something extraordinary or significantly better than I am today. And I don't know how to go from where I am today to there, because the standard practices and processes that I've been doing aren't going to get me. That chasm is going to be solved by innovation. And I think this is where most people use the word innovation. It's the space between the goal we want to get to, where we are today, and we don't know how to get there using traditional means. And so I think that's how it's used. To define it for me, I think innovation is described too complicated. I think that's one of the things that happens is we try to overcomplicate it. For me, innovation is insight plus value. And so when I teach innovation, I really have people focus on gaining new insights. And I spend a lot of time on defining what insights are. And then that needs to be coupled with two important pieces. I think the other piece for making innovation successful is we have to have vision.
Okay.
And that doesn't seem maybe intuitive, but a lot of us really aren't thinking about future worlds, future markets, future businesses, what they would look like. And then the last piece, and I think a lot of your listeners will appreciate this, is innovation doesn't go anywhere without leadership. And the example I use is the wall of shame is the whiteboard or the board with all the Post-its on it. And you walk out of the room. How many times have we walked out of the room and somebody came in to pull all those Post-its off and throw them in the trash? And really, it's about taking those ideas and bringing them out. And so for me, those are kind of the four key areas of insights and value and making sure you have a vision and you're following that up with the right leadership.
Yeah. And I love that in the sense of that insight. I started my career as an engineer working at Rolls-Royce Aerospace. So we were very much around the forefront of technology, working against or with Pratt& Whitney or General Electric at the time. And the key was very much around how do we create innovation that will sustain us in the marketplace? And one thing I learned very early on as a young engineer was we had to be thinking 30 to 50 years in advance to understand what's the future of aviation. Now, the key was you could never know what it was going to be, but you had to look at how to predict the future. And you use that word insight. From a small business perspective, which is where I now work, what would you say is the key things that people need to be aware of to build that insight to help them predict the future?
So I think the key thing is we look at the world right now in terms of how we've always looked at it. And the example I like to use is a case study on a sandwich shop. And my friend Rick worked with his sandwich shop, and it was a small business, and they were trying to improve their lunch service. And he was trying to get them to see things in a different way. And the problem is that in the example of a restaurant where the same thing happens every day, this could be also in a manufacturing facility or in any kind of area where you do much the same thing every day. Everyone who works in the organization sees it exactly the same. And this is the challenge. It's hard to see something different. And so what Rick does is he likes to bring in people who do similar things, but in different areas. And so in this specific example, they were trying to make a more efficient lunch service. Mm-hmm. And so Rick thought about who does he know that works with speed and efficiency, but doesn't know anything about sandwiches. And so he actually brought in somebody from a Formula One pit crew. And in bringing this person in, they talked about speed and efficiency. And I sort of understood that, but the insight didn't come until deep in the conversation when they actually watched a pit stop in a video, and somebody in the sandwich shop suddenly learned, well, how do you talk to one another with all that noise going on? And the person from the pit crew looked up at them and said, well, there's no talking, of course. And the sandwich shop said, well, what do you mean there's no talking? And they said, oh, everything has to be communicated using nonverbal. And that was something that the sandwich shop had never even thought of. Yeah. And what they learned was that the nonverbal communication, so first off, we always communicate nonverbally as well as verbally. And so they had only focused on the verbal communication, and they found if they switched and focused on the nonverbal, they could actually do things without talking that were more efficient. So hand gestures, how people hand things to people. And so here's just an example of sort of how do you get those insights? You really have to get out of what you see every day. And I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in innovation that I have made, and you're an engineer, I was working with some material scientists, and we wanted to work on a particular problem. And so what we did is we got 10 material scientists in a room, and we decided to have a brainstorming session. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work when you get all of the same person in a room. And so I know there's a long answer, but really I just wanted to kind of share an example of you really have to find a way to engage outside of your organization to different people that can help you see things differently, because we're all really kind of clouded in that exactly what we see every day, because that works.
Yeah, and interesting, the quote that comes to mind is the Einstein quote, that a problem can't be solved at the same level at which it was created. And I think when you talk about material scientists, if you're in the room with that same thinking, you actually have that same output from it. Interesting, actually, I've been part of those pit crews in the Formula One team with Williams Formula One for a materials company who were looking at how do they create innovative graduates on the graduate scheme. And they found it useful to take them to the Formula One team to actually do that as an exercise. And it was fascinating to see what they learned from it. So I can talk all day about those type of things, but that's for another story.
Fantastic.
This thing about insights, I think, is key, isn't it? Because actually in businesses, we have to look at how to not just innovate our products and come up with new products, but actually sometimes we need to think about business models. And this word pivot has floated around a lot in the last few years, and no more so than the last 9 to 10 months with what we're going through at the moment, where a lot of businesses have to innovate their business model, not just their product. I wonder, what's your thoughts on business model innovation and pivoting your business as opposed to just innovating your product or your widget?
So I think business model innovation probably has some of the biggest impact and return for our time there. So I think it's, in some sense, it may be more valuable than a single product
Yeah.
to innovate on. It's more difficult. And the reason it's more difficult is oftentimes if I want to innovate on a product, I might talk to a user. And there's different levels. I can actually talk to a user. They can tell me what they want, which is sort of a low level of innovation. That's kind of just sustaining innovation, commodity products. I might interview them. I might do some tools like journey mapping and get some insights into what they need that they really can't tell me. By the way, I just pause here. A great example of that is I do a lot of executive education with companies, and a friend of mine saw me always going back and forth between computers with a USB stick, but my computer has the USB-C, which is the new, and other people had the USB-A, and I had all this difficulty. And one day in the mail just showed up a USB key that has a USB-C and A on it. Yeah. So I can plug it into mine, plug it in the other. And I mean, I'm a pretty bright guy, and I just had never seen this, but just by observing me, he had this insight of this guy has this need. So with that, you can actually work with a user or customer. When it comes to business models, the challenge is it's hard to go out and say to the market, please tell me what it is you need. Let me spend a day with you, Mr. Market, and understand where your needs are. So I think it's a little bit more abstract, and I think that's why it's more challenging. With that said, I think it can have some of the biggest impact. And I did want to share a couple examples with you.
Great.
So one I like is with the clothing business Zara. And so what I loved about them was, you know, we had over the past 100 years, you know, we used to shop by mail in the 1800s, and then we had the department stores come out. And the idea was we were going to have all this selection. You could come in and see your goods. You could try them on. And we kind of progressed. But it was always in this paradigm of, I'm going to figure out what it is you need, what the clothes for the season are going to be. I'm going to stock my store, and that's what it's going to be. What Zara did is they said, look, we are going to stock the store, but we're going to change that stock every week, depending upon how we see our customers needing. And the great story is, lady walks into a Zara store in England and says, hey, do you have any pink scarves? And they say, well, we don't have any pink scarves. And they're trained in their business model to go log the information, pink scarves. Okay. Well, at several other stores that same day and the next day, they noticed people came in and also asked for pink scarves. And they said, well, what do all these people want pink scarves for? And they said, it doesn't matter. Our business model is not to stock with what we think, it's to be responsive. And so they set their business model up to be able to restock their stores in a very short time. They were actually able to source 500,000 pink scarves in 7 days.
Wow.
And they sold out of them in 3 once they hit the stores. And this was all because their business model wasn't the traditional one. It was about building a business that had the fast turn, and that's how they put together that. And I think that was a great one. Another one I'll just share by way of example is work a lot with MasterCard, and they've done some amazing work. And you think MasterCard, you think credit cards, but a lot of the world is cash-based. So how do you build a business model where markets are all cash-based? And they did one in Nairobi, where the community is really run by small mom and pop stores that provide all the groceries and goods. Basically, it's your, if you will, it's your Walmart or Target in, 2 square meters. And they're all cash-based. And so what they found was that they couldn't grow. An example was I could sell 10 packs of diapers every week, but I can only afford to buy 5 from the distributor.
Okay.
So what they need is a loan or some credit, but they're all cash-based. They don't bank. And they were struggling with how to solve this. And then they pivoted from this mindset of, we're going to look for credit from the person who's going to sell the goods. And they backed up and they said to the distributor who brings the diapers to them, do you have records? And they said, yes, of course, we have lots of records of the shipping and what we sell them every month and their payments. And they said, well, why don't we use your records as the distributor? And the distributor in this example was Unilever. Okay. Why don't we use your records to establish credit for that particular store, and we'll set up a loan or facilitate a loan program for them to do that. And so this was a pivot from the focus on the mom and pop shop where their business model wouldn't work to one that was there. So there's just 2 examples of finding a way to create the value. I think one of the things that really surprises me is oftentimes when I want to do something, the funding isn't direct And so I find, the question is who's going to pay for this? When you
Yeah.
do research, for instance, it's always, well, we can go to some grant writing agency, but sometimes they're just not there. So how do you pay for the research or pay for what you want to do? And sometimes it's not obvious how we do it. We have to figure out a new business model.
Ways around it. And the interesting thing that came to mind when you talk about that is in MasterCard, or and you mentioned Unilever, you expect that they've got creative people there. But the mom and pop business or the small business or the startups have it. But what about the business which is growing and they're fixed in their ways? We talk about cultural creativity, but how do people, when they're fixed in the ways, suddenly get creative? Coming back to your team about material scientists earlier, if they're stuck doing the same job all the time, they have to come out of that mindset and think differently. But if they don't know what they don't know, sometimes they're stuck. I wonder what's your thoughts on helping businesses encourage their teams and the individuals to step up and become creative?
So I think there's a couple things that I found very effective. The first one is you should allow those who are creative to come forward. And so this is something that I was actually taught by the chief information officer for Washington, D.C. And so she took over for an organization, I think it was 600 or 1,000 people, and they had a small innovation team. And they were the people who innovated and not everybody else. And she found that wasn't very effective. So she disbanded the team. And then she just said, look, we're going to have an innovation meeting at 6 p.m. second Tuesday of every month. You're welcome to attend. And what that did was she found people from all over the place came out of the woodwork, per se, to join this meeting. And she found 30 people who in the organization she would have never known wanted to be innovative, wanted to be creative. And that was sort of the low-hanging fruit that we don't do. And I think you could really kind of instill upon that. I think we have to understand there's also a spectrum of people who want to engage. Some people feel really safe in doing the same kind of expert work they've always done. Some feel really good being kind of creative and out there. So there's a little bit of a balance. But first is pull out those who want to. The next piece is getting everyone to realize that their expertise is a hindrance in solving new problems. And here's just a simple example that I use when I teach executive education classes for companies. So here's the problem. It's a little bit of a math problem. How many cubic meters of dirt are in a hole 10 meters by 2 meters by 3 meters?
10 by 2 by 3.
Yeah.
Okay. So roughly 60 cubic meters.
Now you're an engineer, aren't you? Or you were an engineer by training?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Now, if you listen carefully, I said, how many cubic meters of dirt were in a hole?
Okay.
There's none.
None in the hole originally.
None in a hole. So what's interesting is when we do this, anyone with a technical background immediately goes to the figures to do the calculation.
Yeah.
Human resources, human resources and lawyers are the ones that typically get this right first.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is to kind of show, look, you're really skilled at what you do, and that makes you solve problems you're used to. Let's start looking at a few problems that you can't solve. And then slowly people start to realize, I mean, really, I say, look, if you're an expert and the problem is like you're an expert in, you may not need innovation. Innovation is not a tool to replace being an expert. Innovation is a tool of what happens when you get to a point where you can't solve it. You got to come up with something new. Yeah. And I think that gets people to start to realize, okay, innovation is a tool I can use. And that gets people to be open to training. By the way, I think one of the pieces that leaders in companies don't realize is no one is taught how to innovate. There's even in today's modern schools, there's really no program on this is how you innovate, this is how you be creative. And so your people don't have the skills. And, every once in a while, you'll find people who naturally have it. But you need to start with, they were taught how to, design a bridge. They were taught how to give great customer service or make sales, but they weren't taught to innovate. So the first piece is that leadership can do is understand that's something that we have to proactively teach. And in the end, you have to set up some metrics as a leader that encourage innovation, and they aren't very difficult at all. So some of the things that I recommend is ask your people.
Yeah.
You know, in the US, we do performance reviews quarterly or annually.
Yeah.
You know, you can ask the question of what new ideas did you present to the company that you weren't asked to present?
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And then people say, well, I did everything you asked. And I think that's one of the challenges is right now we manage with, I tell you what to do, I set expectations, you meet those.
Mm-hmm.
We need to start saying, okay, how did you go beyond that? And we really don't want to give a lot of criticism, whether it was a good or a bad, but we start that kind of ideas. And so Los Angeles, the city actually wanted to build a culture of innovation. And one of the things they started to do was in the performance reviews, they started having a section on innovation.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
love it.
very simple, but if you start to have that as an expectation, the other thing that San Jose did,
Yeah.
they're run by a lot of tech guys, is they started hiring in people. And one of the criteria for hiring new people was that they scored high on sort of an innovation scale. And they found that they pulled the organization towards that. And so that's another way that we can do that. So those are some effective tools I've seen.
Yeah. And I love that in terms of actually building that culture of innovation. And I have a phrase, what you measure is what you get. So if you're measuring creativity, you're going to get it. But you've got to put that into the mix in the first place, because if people aren't aware they're needing to bring it forwards, they're not going to do more with it. I just want to back up slightly in terms, you mentioned about no one's taught innovation. I find this interesting in the sense that having done an MBA best part of 20 years ago now, you're right, innovation was not on the syllabus at that time. We didn't talk about it, but we had to come up with creative ideas for doing things. And I work as a coach now, and a lot of people come to me with issues or problems. And to help them solve their issues, my belief is they've got all the resources they need within them to do that themselves. They just haven't asked themselves the right questions. So I'm wondering, in that case, when you're looking at creativity, what's the questions you need to ask in the organization? Apart from looking at performance reviews, what's the questions you need to ask specifically to say, how do we do something different? How do we find a new way that's not just incremental, but it's evolutionary, if that's what's needed?
So one of the things that I teach is decision making. What do you decide to work on? What ideas do you choose?
Yeah.
And so the traditional one is sort of a Venn diagram of feasibility, desirability, and viability. And you kind of look for the intersection of those three.
Okay.
You know, can we make it? Should we make it? Is it part of our strategy? And that makes good business sense.
Yeah.
When we come to creative ideas, once again, my friend Rick taught me this. He says, look, he said, get rid of feasibility and viability and just focus on desirability. Is it something that is interesting and cool? And so oftentimes when we work with executives, we'll ask them to choose problems that just seem really interesting, really cool, really different, and exclude any feasibility as part of that. So that's one of the first things that we can do, because a lot of times we don't focus in that area. The other two things that I'll share with creativity is the one is we want creativity to be new ideas that are valuable or that are relevant. I don't know how many of you have been listening here have been on a brainstorming session, and you can say anything you want. People start going way off topic to be creative. That's not really being creative. It's kind of just being disruptive, if you will, in a negative way there. So what we want to do is kind of find ways that people can think about new ideas that are relevant to the work. And that's why analogies and the sandwich shop example I gave were really great. The other one is some research out of Harvard Business School. Teresa Mabile did research exclusively on creativity and productivity in organizations.
Okay.
And she has the following test, and I'm just going to paraphrase here. So which of the following do you think best predicts employee satisfaction and their creativity? Rewards and incentives,
Okay.
clear goals, resources, progress in their task, or support by their coworkers.
Mm-hmm. So rewards and incentives, clear goals, resources, progress in the task, and support from their co-workers.
Yes.
Interesting, actually, because my initial one would go towards rewards and incentives.
And that is where most people go.
Yeah.
But now that you feel like that maybe not the one where we're targeted at, which would be your next one that you'd go to?
So I'm wondering, in that case, you've got to have the support to do things. So actually the resource around you
Okay, great.
in
That's
terms of the
that's another
coaching,
great one. Yeah.
but not the right one.
No, surprisingly, her research has shown that it is the progress in the task.
Wow. Okay.
And the reason is that creativity comes from intrinsic motivation.
Okay. Not the extrinsic reward. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. So there is no way to force someone to be creative. And I think this is what's important, because we described it before, let people who are creative come forward. You need to allow people to bring that creativity out. And the example that I like to use is a puzzle book. Now imagine I gave you a puzzle book of mazes, and I said, I'll give you, $100 for tracing out from the in to the output for every page.
Yeah.
And most people will be like, okay, well, I'll do one, and I'll go to the next page, I'll go to the next page. And then I said, okay, when you're done, how many of you would go back to the first maze and look if there was a second way to go through it when you don't get paid? And the answer is only someone who had fun doing mazes. And so creativity a lot of times is finding alternative solutions for things. And people tend to do this when they're having fun. And so that's why I think it's important. If you're a small to medium-sized company, let's say you've got 50 people in your company, you might try to find the 5 or 6 that are really excited about the topic you want more creative ideas about, and work with them. And maybe a different topic you want to work on. So maybe it's a sales or marketing strategy. Maybe there's a different set of group that you would work on a technical solution. But that's why letting people volunteer for kind of these groups is really is really good. And I think that's an important piece. And just as an aside for a management strategy, I have found, and the example I use is, how many of you enjoy cleaning because when you clean, it's clean at the end? And that's exactly what Teresa Mabalé is teaching. That's a simple task, but really the enjoyment comes from I've made progress and succeeded.
Yeah.
And that's where everybody in the organization wants to be. And I think as a leader, if we can make people feel like they are making progress and succeeding, then they feel good about themselves. And I'll have to say, when I do research, one of the most frustrating pieces is I'll go week after week, realizing I'm not making any progress. And that's probably the most frustrating part of it all.
Yeah. And the segue I think is really key there, actually, David, is around purpose and engagement. We often talk in business around, why, and looking at what's the purpose. A lot of our work is actually now around how do we grow the value of a business. And one of the key things around is linking it to purpose. And the business that I run at the moment is very much around helping people find a purpose above and beyond making money. Because if you can engage people in your why, that isn't just about making money. People will willingly come to work. They'll work with their hearts, minds, blood, sweat, and tears, not just for your cash. So they're going for the intrinsic rather than the extrinsic, because money only gets you so far. And the fascinating bit what you're saying there is actually, you said having fun is key. Because I think in a business context, actually people want to come to work and have fun. Now, not everybody can do that because they haven't got the choice to do it, or they have, but they haven't realized that. But when you're in a business where you can come to work and have fun, when you can deliver something that's of value and help people do something useful to society, you get more engaged people. I'm wondering whether there's a correlation there between those type of businesses and innovation at some stage. And I don't know the answer, I'm just throwing that out there.
No, I will have to say that, there's a popular band, it's called OK Go. And they've sort of pivoted on the traditional model. We used to have bands that we'd go see in live, and then MTV came along, and we'd have all these music videos. Well, they went even further, and they basically do a video. Usually it's like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's some crazy video. In one of them, they exploded like 500 things in 4 seconds. And then what they do is they play the video in slow motion, and then they play their music to the video. And the cool part, the music's decent, but the cool part is the juxtaposition and this cool video that they've done. So it's really about this creative idea of the video. And they asked the head of OK Go, where does he get his ideas? And he says, when I was a kid, I put everything up on my wall in my bedroom, and I would actually close one eye or the other, or take my hand and block out part and try to connect different things.
Yeah.
And what I found was, you don't have a good idea, you find a good idea. And I think this is one of the really important things about innovation is innovation doesn't happen. You just don't sit there and a good idea comes to you. I think this is one of the challenges with Zoom right now is we don't have the interactions we used to. So it's much harder, I think, to be creative. But for innovation, you have to go out and seek. And so I think when you talk about the purpose-led people, they're looking to accomplish a goal, they're looking to push forward, they're looking to discover and solve new problems. And that's where the innovation happens. And I just kind of want to share a case example from my innovation class at Harvard. We had a gentleman who came in from New Jersey. Philadelphia is right next to New Jersey, and he was doing supermarkets. He wanted to do a public service, and they have what they call food deserts in poor areas. And a food desert is the area is too poor for a major retailer to put a supermarket or a grocery in. So what you're left with are small stores that don't really have all the food selection or the nutrition. And so it's a kind of, you spiral out, you know. Wow. A dad has to take a bus for an hour to get to a real supermarket, can't just go down to the street corner. And so in these food deserts, he wanted to open up a supermarket. And this is a great story of innovation. Is the first thing he did was he did a town hall with the residents at a church and said, look, what would you guys like? And they started with the initial superficial things. Look, we don't like supermarkets that have bars on the window because you're telling us that we're all thieves. You know, we don't like it that you have an ATM with a high service charge for us. We don't like it that, you know, you're only stocking the things that you think will make the most money on. You're not stocking the stuff that we need. And they went through the superficial ones and they found things, for instance, in a lot of the neighborhoods in Philadelphia, there was a lot of ethnic diversity. And so they needed halal foods. They needed, there's a large Ethiopian population. There's specific Ethiopian grains that they were interested in having. And these, you know, weren't traditional. So he opened up a supermarket, and you go inside of the supermarket and suddenly you see they have a diversity of products that really speak to what the people want. And they have a variety there. They realize that health is a problem. So they actually have a nutritionist that will help people put together dinners. And so that was great, but he had such a passion for helping these people that they sat down and they said, what else do you need? And they said, well, what do you mean? The supermarket's great. Beyond the supermarket. And they said, well, we're having a lot of trouble banking. And he says, well, what are your problems? He goes, well, I don't have a bank account. I can't cash a check. I go to a money cashing place, has a high charge. And so what they did is they worked on a way using some digital technology to get a bank in there that would allow anyone to open up an account for no fee. And so now they had a place to bank.
Wow. Yeah.
And then what he realized was a lot of people could get money, but didn't know how to get it from the government. So they opened up a social services office in the supermarket that allowed people to come in and they would teach them how to fill out the paperwork. In the US, we have things called food stamps and other support programs and how they could get their benefits. But this was really just going back to your purpose driven. A lot of the innovation was around him asking people what they wanted. And so now it's not, in essence, if we go back to Nairobi, this kind of mom and pop 2 square, and when I say 2 square meters, I literally mean 2 square meters of how big the shops are. It's literally a door and a little couple bookshelves in there. That's what this this place has become. It's become the place where the community goes to. And so anyway, it's a long case study, but fascinating on how that need and purpose drove a lot of different innovations.
Yeah, and I love it in a sense that they're looking at what else, but the key is asking the customers what they need, and part of that is giving them the space, because sometimes people don't know what they need. 20 years ago we used to use the Walkman case study from Sony, that nobody knew they needed a Walkman until Sony produced this thing, and we all had one I'm going back a few years now, in the 80s effectively.
Yes,
but actually that was the product innovation that said, okay, we can carry our music around with us. And I think if you'd asked the customer, they probably wouldn't have known they needed it. So what is it that you can do to help customers realize they need something that doesn't exist yet? How do you help them be creative and say, actually, this is what I need?
So, it's interesting. Some people ask me, how do you get people to adopt new products and new technologies? And my first answer to that, and I'll come back and answer your specific question, is if it adds value, people will adopt it. I mean, how many of us have seen our parents My mother just passed away. She was in her mid 70s, and she would email me every day. Why did she email? Because email was her way to keep in contact with her kids and her grandchildren. And so if there's value there, people will adopt it. There may be a learning curve. So one of the things, if people aren't adopting the product, then it may be that there's not the value that's there. I think also most people spend zero time. So most of your customers and clients spend zero time thinking about what they need. They're very reactive. And I think that's something that you have to realize is this is the mode they're in. It's not that they can't think of new ideas. It's that's just not something that they do. So, one of the options is to sit down and talk to them about what they can have. I was just watching a great documentary on design about Nike doing the Air Jordans. And the designers sat down with Michael Jordan and, they talked about things. And Michael basically said, look, you can talk all day and give me drawings. It doesn't really mean a lot to me. And so what they did is they pulled out shoes and they said, Michael, let's just go through these and talk about how we could improve these shoes. And I think this is a real great technique is whenever we can change the modality of how we're talking about something. So if we can do it with a physical item. Also, there's a lot of nonverbal stuff we can see. Having something visualization is all our stronger. And so they went through a lot of the design features that way that Michael Jordan would never be able to discuss, but he could now because he'd ask, I always wondered why there wasn't a flap here and why can't I move this across here? And, this always annoyed me. But yeah, people just don't think, they so here's a great one. We just did, I think you've participated doing an executive education class online during COVID for free. And we just did design thinking last week. And we used a case of a Peruvian movie theater. And they were trying to figure out, how to get their customers to understand what they were doing. And in the case study that I like it because it's a case study at a Harvard Business School, not that Harvard Business School is the only place to go, but they had videos that showed the interviews and the process, which was very helpful. But at the very beginning, and we did this in our class online, is I said, if you wanted to get ideas from customers, what would you do? And I would say over half the people in our class came back with some sort of, I'll do a survey. And if you read the case study, which is based on IDEO, IDEO says the first mistake people make is you do a survey. Well, the problem with a survey is a survey understands what questions to ask. The survey comes at the end. The survey is the verification that you've got all the right questions. At the beginning, you don't know what the right questions to ask are, and so and your clients and customers don't know what to answer, and so you have to find a way to engage them in a different way. And some of the limitations your customers and clients have is they don't understand the technology. They don't understand the business models. They don't understand the finances that you can provide. So they don't see the value that you have. And so they can't imagine the new project. So I think that's partially why we need to work together in a collaborative way to look and find these new ideas.
And I think that word collaboration is really key, actually. We've got a few more minutes to go now. There's a couple of questions I'd love to ask you around building collaboration in teams. But before that, I'd love to come back to this design thinking process, because I think the design thinking process is really key. And there's one word that you put in the middle of that, which is this word ideate.
Yes.
And ideation, I think, is one of the key things there, because getting people to think differently, getting people to come up with their other ideas. And then you talk about prototyping. So we talked just now about getting people to come up with ideas, and we talked about the banking and the supermarket and come up with the different things like that. But how do you create this culture within a business where people are free to come up with ideas that are off the wall sometimes, that you've never thought about in that ideation process, which goes back to some of the conversation earlier, but I just wonder what you've got thoughts around that for the smaller businesses.
Sure. So I think, when I teach innovation, I say, look, innovation starts with the lemonade stand. So this is, I think I've learned, is the US kind of paradigm. So in the US, there's a little story that the kids will want to make some money. And so they'll go make a pitcher of lemonade and they'll put it out by the street. And they'll charge, a quarter or 50 cents or $1, and they'll make some money. And it's really the first time that children learn that they can create something of value and get something in return for it. Because everything else up to that point is given to them. And so this is really the first experience. And so I take that analogy into the corporation. And first step is you need to have the people that work with you, work for you, understand that everyone is allowed and expected to come up with ideas that you haven't asked them for. This idea that if you have some ideas on how we can make new products or how we can improve, that is something we absolutely want. And you have to give, now here's the thing, there's two key pieces to that. You have to give them a way to share their ideas with you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So it could be an idea box. It could be the supervisors having it part of the review. It could be an online platform, but they have to know how to give you the idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just to give you an example of that, I worked for American Power Conversion. They make the backup power supplies for computers.
Okay.
And in the 90s, and somebody in the loading truck realized he could tell what unit was in what box by its weight.
Okay, clever.
And so what he said was, for quality, why don't we just put a scale on the conveyor belt? And so we'll just weigh every unit that goes by, and you'll have an instant check. I mean, it costs a few $100s to put this on. And so how did this idea come up? It had to be that the founder and vice president of engineering happened to be on the truck loading boxes with him because they were having a crisis. And he picked up a box and said, no, something's wrong here. And he said, how did you know it was wrong? He goes, well, I've noticed that the weight is a difference here. Yeah. And so he had to chance meeting with the vice president of engineering to get this idea across. So you need to have a better way than that is there. And the other one is you need to have feedback. If people give you new ideas, you need to have some feedback. I worked with an oil and gas company in Texas, and they were using an online platform for crowdsourcing of ideas. And what they found was crowdsourcing works if people get feedback that their ideas might mean something, or at least they've been looked at. Yeah. With that said, I'm not a big fan of crowdsourcing, because you talk about how do we get really out of the box ideas, and I'll share with you something that I've learned. Most people have only a small space around their current thinking that they can really move into. So how do you get breakaway ideas? You find somebody whose space is different.
Yes. Yeah.
And so in your organization, you really need to find the people that are thinking differently. I talk a lot about diversity, and in the modern context, we talk about diversity as maybe race, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic. But my daughter goes to a small private school, and they pride themselves on, I think there's maybe 200 students there, and they're from 33 different nations. Wow. But in her third grade class, every third grader talks the same, watches the same cartoons, plays the same. It doesn't matter that all their parents are from these 33 different nations. They're all exactly the same. Yeah. And that's not what we want. What we want are people that think very differently. And that's what I think we want to curate. And in your organization, you're going to have people that think differently. And you want to pull those out because they're going to see things on a different perspective. And I'll give you a tool for finding somebody who thinks differently. Find somebody you don't want to sit down and have a coffee with. All right. I mean, it seems, but if you think about it, everybody who you want to go get a coffee with, how many of you have a friend who can finish your sentences? Yeah. Right. Did you see the game this weekend? That was awesome. And they know exactly which game you're talking about. And they know exactly which, part of the game you were speaking of. Yeah. Those people are looking at the world, seeing your world. And that's who we are drawn to. Yeah. Because the energy is very low to interact with. The support system is very good. And by the way, those are also very efficient. And companies a lot of times hire people for the right culture. Yeah. And really, it's about that efficiency. If we see the world the same way, I don't have to explain everything to you. But there are people that I sit down with and just don't see the world in the same way. Now, I have an engineering background. One of the things I found, I do a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking around the world, flight attendants, amazing people, but they just see the world completely different. And I'll have conversations with them, and how they perceive, political things going on and how I perceive them are completely different. And I just use that as one because they're just a very different world. And so find somebody you don't want to have a cup of coffee with, and sit down and I guarantee they're going to have different ideas than you have.
Love that. I think it's a great thing. And it's interesting you mentioned your daughter there. I often find my daughters are some of the best sources of inspiration because they come up with things. My youngest is now 15. And when she was younger, she would often come up with very different off the wall things. And I know there's been lots of research done into this about children's creativity and how it declines through the schooling years. And you mentioned about the diversity in the class, but actually everyone watches the same cartoons, listens to the same music. But I think when you get those children who are young enough and ask them things, and I know when I was building my first business, I'd ask my daughters, what do you think of this? Because I found a 9-year-old give me some great impressions on whether it worked or not, or come up with some right ideas. And I think there's something there about harnessing the young people's talent.
Well, there is, and I think people talk about, I'd like to kind of touch on this because I think this is important. People talk about children being creative and they somehow lose it. And the reason they lose it is because slowly they learn how things work and go together.
Yeah. Okay.
And the thing about children is they don't know. So the example that a friend of mine, he's actually a hip hop artist, shared about creativity. He says, look, you know, kids will put together different things. They'll put together peanut butter and chocolate and say, this is delicious, right? And we might say, yeah, that sounds like this can be good. Well, a kid will then take chocolate milk and mashed potatoes and put them together. Now, as an adult, I can tell you right now that this is not going to be very good. But for the kid, they're exactly the same, right? They have no kind of filter. And that's the problem we have is we experts, as we become experts in our business, we don't have kind of this playfulness to move things around. And you talk about children giving inspiration. It's interesting. My daughter gave me the same advice that the chief executive of the city of Dublin, Ireland, so the capital of Ireland, Ireland's very innovative. This is the head of the city, had the same idea that my daughter had. So my daughter expressed it as the following. She goes, Daddy, I want to go build something today. I want to build something with like a hammer and nails and things. And I was kind of frustrated. I'm like, honey, I'm thinking this is gonna take forever. I don't know what she wants. I'm like, let's just go to the hobby store and we'll get a kit. Like, why don't you go with Mom to the hobby store and find a kit to make a bird feeder? So she goes with Mom, she comes back and she pulls out this bag and I look at it and there's a picture of a bird feeder on it so I can understand this. And I say, honey, this isn't a kit, this is just wood. And she said, Dad, it wouldn't be creative if they gave us instructions.
Love it. Wonderful.
And translate this to Dublin. Right now, all of the cities, we talk about the time we're in, all of the cities right now are finding a tremendous amount of innovation and change in a very positive way.
Yeah.
Because all of the reasons not to do something have just been minimized because of the great need to make the changes. And the gentleman's name is Owen Keegan. What Owen said was, he says, you know, in classical businesses, we're taught to have like a book of how you do your job so that when you leave, the next person could go in and could read that book and understand how to do it. And they actually have manuals on how to do your jobs in lots of big companies.
Yeah. Yeah.
He says, I want to throw those out because what you're doing is you're telling the person how you did the job.
Yeah.
What you want is the new person to come in and see how to do the job in a brand new way. And it's the same way that Julia kind of said, of, you know, how do you do without instructions? And when you talk about how do you build this culture of innovation, I think this is another thing leaders can do, is particularly when you're hiring in some of your senior people, don't give them a lot of direction. Give them some open space for them to bring in there. When we talked earlier about a lot of people can't really get much beyond their own ideas. Yeah. If you're bringing in somebody that's very different, let them kind of explore the space in a very different way. And that will allow them to see things that you never would have. And we just need to give them that opportunity.
Yeah. David, this has been fascinating. Thank you. And there's lots of subjects we've talked about there, which I could go on and on for talking about. We're going to run out of time, but the bit I think that ties this together, you were talking there about people and expertise. And I love that thing about it wouldn't be creative if you gave them us instructions. And I often use the phrase that Vern Harnish uses when he talks about business leaders. And he says that often the business is stifled by the owner or the creator of the business because they're stuck in their model of thinking. And I think the bit that I take away, and I'd love listeners to take away from this, is actually we need to throw away the rules of how we've done it in the past and give new people the chance to reinvent the business, because then they can come up with ways of doing it that we haven't seen, because sometimes we're too close to the issue and we just don't know it can be done any differently. So Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's been a useful one. One final question in that case, which a question I often ask and often people ask is, I always look at the pile of books behind me and think we've all got books, and Vern Harnish and Scaling Up introduced me to a great Better Business Book Club where we can look at business books that have changed our lives. If you were to suggest one book, or maybe two, that have changed your life or the way you look at the world, what would it be?
That is a difficult question. Interestingly enough, I like to explore,
Okay.
rather than read. I think Walter Isaacson's book, The Innovators,
Okay.
was a great book. Walter Isaacson is a fantastic journalist, but it really takes the very beginning of the internet and shows us how it all got connected together. So it was really a great story of the ideas of where things came from, and the little innovations that happened. And so I'm just going to leave with that one, because that was a really great book that's there. And for me, it's a story of ideas and how ideas change. And I think that's for me. I mean, I research innovation, so that's what I'm focused in.
Yeah, love it. Thank you, Dr. David Ricketts. Thank you. It's been great to talk to you. I'm sure the listeners will get great value out of this, just listening to some of the ideas. Where can people find you if they're looking for more information, either with your Harvard program or yourself directly?
The easiest way is just to go to Dr. David Ricketts, Dr. David Ricketts, 2Ts.com.
Marvelous. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure being here.
Yeah, David, thank you. That was great. Love talking to you there. I got reams of notes there. My PA is going to have wonders typing up my handwriting after this. There's one thought that's gone through my mind, actually. I work with a car company, and you mentioned Ferrari last week. I work with a competitor for Ferrari.
They don't have any competitors. They've told me this.
Interesting. Yeah, mine's a German one. We're often so I'm running a coaching program for the leaders in the Porsche program.
Oh, fantastic.
So I'm just thinking that there's often things we're looking at where we're looking at guest speakers. Do you ever do guest speaking at events where we can, in a virtual space?
Yep, absolutely. I would be more than honored and be happy to.
Okay. I don't know what it is. I'm just thinking of some ideas for next year. We've got a program running which the guys graduate from in April. It's a leadership management program, but we're just toying with ideas of how we make their graduation come alive in a virtual space, because we're not going to be able to meet physically. So I just there's a thought there for me which I might come back to.
That would be great, and I'd be happy to brainstorm a little bit on what might be good for them there, but would be glad to. And it's interesting. I was talking to Ferrari, and they he says, like, don't understand Ferraris until you drive one. And I said, well, the cheapest one you have is $239,000. So I think the only way I'm driving one is when you invite me over to go driving. Yeah. On the flip side, I've driven a few Porsches, and actually my brother, he just turned 50, and as soon as the pandemic's over, we're going to go just west of Atlanta. They have a Porsche driving school, so we're going to go for 2 days. You get to drive all of them, and it's just, it's a different experience when you actually get out on a race course with them, because you really understand what they can do. Yeah,
I've not done that, but I envy the people that can. And we've got a driving school at Silverstone, local to me, which is about 50 miles away. Right. And a lot of people rave about the car. And I think Porsche and Ferrari are very different vehicles in that sense.
They are. And it's interesting, because one of the questions I asked Ferrari was, why do your cars look beautiful? And it's their culture. It is, it's in the mindset. It's not, performance has to be beautiful. And I think if you look at a Porsche, I think all the Porsche cars are attractive. However, function plays a much bigger role.
It does. Yeah. They're engineering led.
Yes. And Ferrari was not. Ferrari was inspiration led.
Yeah.
And their mantra now is the essence of Ferrari is what their culture is. And it's an essence. It's not a technology. It's an essence.
Still it. Love it.
So
I think it's great thing. David, thank you. Really appreciate it. Great to have you along. And I'll get this produced in January effectively now, but I'll send you a copy as soon as it's done. I appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Wonderful Christmas. Thank you very much.
Take care. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.